Hello and welcome to the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. We bring you interviews from people who have conquered the trickiest of health challenges using the Functional Diagnostic Nutrition philosophy and similar healing modalities. You're going to hear from experts who have been through the ringer with their health issues and yet managed to come out on the other side. You can always visit us at functionaldiagnosticnutrition.com, but for now, here is today's episode. All right. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Detective Podcast by Functional Diagnostic Nutrition. My name is Evan Transu, aka Detective Ev, and I will be your host for today's show, episode number 423 of the Health Detective Podcast. And this, if you are watching live with us right now or shortly after it was released on the live, the video version, that is, this is going to be our last podcast until July. And that is not because we are taking some giant summer vacation or leaving you guys without live events. It is exactly the opposite of that. We have more live events for you than you possibly could know what to do with. And that is because we are about to do our 4th annual summer open house event starting on June 2nd. So that's fdntraining.com/SOH 2025. You can see the full details there. And summer open house, I'll give it a very summarized version of it to not take a ton of time. What is it? This is for people who love the clinical side, but also for people who love the business side. We kind of do a bit of everything. Normally our events are only one or the other because it gets kind of confusing. But with Summer Open House, we go live with you guys pretty much every single day other than the weekends for the entire month of June. We have 6-figure FDN business sessions. We got an awesome keynote for you guys at the end where we give away a bunch of advanced courses just for attending live. And then we have things like Detective Hour, which are things that sessions that only the graduates typically get to see at FDN. Detective Hour is a place where we can submit cases and have our clinical advisors analyze it more or less live to our graduates. And then you get those the recordings of it even when you join later. So there's a bunch of cool stuff. It is completely free. The only time that you'd have to pay anything is if you want the replays, but any event that you attend live is completely free. So that's fdntraining.com/SOH 2025. Basically, if you love anything clinical or business regarding functional medicine, Summer Open House is for you, and I will be hosting all those events. So I'm looking forward to seeing some familiar names there. All right, moving on to our guest and this topic. I figured this would be a really cool one and fun one to do right before we start our Summer Open House, especially because this season, this time of year, for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere at least, this is something a lot of us have to worry about. I grew up in a place in Pennsylvania where Lyme disease, other tick-borne illnesses, I shouldn't say the other ones because those really aren't well known, but let's just say illness from ticks and other things like that are extremely common. People don't really know what to do with it, though. I would imagine there are thousands of people, if not tens of thousands of people in my county alone who are walking around with long-term complications from these things without knowing it, or they did know it and took just the antibiotics and then thought, okay, well, I'm going to be fine. And some issue they have 5 to 10 years down the road, it's never connected. So if you don't already know what I'm talking about, I'll read our guest's bio here and we will get into the main topic. Nicole Bell is an author, entrepreneur, and advocate for tick-borne and neurodegenerative diseases. Her memoir, What Lurks in the Woods, details her husband's harrowing experience with misdiagnosed tick-borne illness and seeks to help others navigate chronic conditions. Originally from Boston, Massachusetts, Nicole earned a bachelor's and master's of science in materials science and engineering from MIT and a master's of science in biomedical engineering from Duke University. So I'm sorry it's not one of our more intelligent guests for you guys today. I hope that her credentials are okay. Nicole is currently the CEO of Galaxy Diagnostics, where she combines her professional experience with her passion to change the tick-borne disease landscape. Galaxy's mission is to create a new diagnostic standard of care for tick-borne diseases and save millions of people from descending into chronic illness. I could not think of like a cooler thing to be hyper passionate about. So welcome to the show, Nicole.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here.
All right, so I was checking your information, obviously, in the days leading up to this. And one of the things that we always ask to start off the show is what did the individual's health symptoms look like and where did they begin, or when did they begin? I'm sorry. But in this case, from my understanding, this was completely about helping your husband and figuring out what was going on with him. So I might switch the question to say, what did his health symptoms look like and when did those begin?
Yeah. So the when did it begin is a really interesting question that in retrospect I constantly debate, right? I think when I first noticed that there was a real problem was around 2016 timeframe, and it was really more mood based at first. So he was anxious, he was depressed, he was withdrawn, and he was a very social, outgoing individual, but his personality just really changed. And I thought that it was really more discomfort with our lifestyle. He had kind of stepped back and retired early to take care of our young children. And I was like, please go back to work, right? Like, this is not working for you. But then I realized that he was having cognitive issues, right? He was a brilliant engineer, electrical engineer, computer scientist, but all of a sudden he couldn't remember the time to pick up the kids from daycare. And he couldn't remember a 4-digit alarm code to our security system. And something is seriously wrong. And I actually suspected Lyme disease like right out of the gate. I researched like random things like brain fog and cognitive issues, and Lyme disease came up, and that really resonated with me because he was a hunter. He was always in the woods. We had many tick exposures over the years, and he'd lived in several endemic areas, and so. In our first doctor's appointment, we had him tested, but he tested negative, which, I can talk about more some of the challenges with testing because it's a big passion of mine now. And that threw us off the trail. And eventually he was given a diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease. And at the time that he got his PET scan, his scans showed that he was actually in the late stages of cognitive decline. So I was still trying to figure out something was really wrong more than just him being unhappy and depressed. And they were telling me he was in the late stages of Alzheimer's. So I was pretty much floored.
When you realize or get this new information, right? Like you're already knowing something's wrong, but now it's at a whole different level.
Yes.
What were some of the initial steps that you guys took? And I'm saying it this way because for you to even be interested in this topic of like kind of chronic illnesses and issues that happen with tick-borne illness, it's kind of hard to not end up in this functional medicine or natural medicine space. It's certainly not exclusive to that because there is Western medicine interventions that can be useful for a lot of this, but usually they overlap. And the reason I'm saying it this way is because unless I'm wrong, based on your background so far, other than maybe a side passion or interest, I haven't heard anything to indicate that you guys would have been interested in these alternative medical treatments or options up until possibly now. So what were the first things that you even did when you heard this? Did you immediately jump into something more natural, or did you follow a more conventional approach?
So, I mean, our first doctor's appointment where we had that first test done, I actually went to an integrative physician because I just instinctively knew that the standard 15-minute appointment wasn't going to get us what we needed, right? Like he was outwardly extremely healthy, physically fit, but there were changes in him that I could see because I was so close to him. And I just knew that I needed somebody who was going to dive deep. And they did a whole panel of lab work. And, I had literally 10 pages of lab results that said he was quote unquote normal, right? And then they referred us to a neurologist. And so we did the neurologist bump around for quite some time. I mean, literally saw several of them looking for answers because I'm an engineer by training, right? I like root causes. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. I had him genetically tested. There were no genetic markers associated with Alzheimer's disease, no comorbidities, no lifestyle factors. Like he was eating a Mediterranean diet, all the things that you're supposed to do for brain health, he was doing it, yet he was declining young and very quickly. And I'm like, this just doesn't make any sense. And all the research that I dove into it didn't seem to fit. And so I raged against the machine for a while. And then actually it was about 15 months after that first appointment where my brother actually was the one who convinced me to get him retested and returned to kind of tick-borne disease because my sister-in-law actually got diagnosed after years of her own health battles and found out that the root of her issue was tick-borne. And my brother's a doctor and he started researching. And so then at that point I got him retested and found out not only did he have Lyme disease, but he also had Bartonella and Babesia, which are two common co-infections. And, from there, we sought out a Lyme literate physician, and we've been in the functional medicine and integrative, functional medicine Lyme literate world ever since. Even with my kids who are healthy, other than to get the standard sports forms and so forth, we go straight to functional medicine, because I truly believe that that's where you need to go, not only when you're ill, but also just to maintain optimal wellness.
I promise that we'll have the opportunity to get into more of the technical information, because most guests want to do that, especially one with your background. I'm guessing you're like, I want to share some data with these people, but I'm also infinitely fascinated by people's stories. And there's one thing I wanted to go back to. You said it was about 15 months before your brother recommended someone. Now, with where you're at now, 15 months is almost like, oh, matter of fact. I think about 15 months of someone dealing with these types of things, and I've dealt with my own chronic symptoms, right? I didn't get into this by accident. 15 months can be a very long time, depending on what's going on. So can I ask, like, what the heck was happening in that 15 months? Were you guys making any progress? I'm sure you were trying different things, but was any progress being made, or was this kind of becoming a hopeless situation for a little bit?
It was becoming a hopeless situation. I mean, I think for the first 6 to 7 months, I raged against the machine and went to doctor trying to get answers. And after 6 to 7 months, actually, it was Russ, my husband, who kind of looked at me and he said, "Look, if this is gonna happen, we need to prepare, right? Like, we have young children. We need to really figure out how we're gonna manage through this, how you're gonna manage through this after I'm gone." And so we kind of began the process of acceptance, even though it still didn't make any sense, just because we didn't have any alternative. And then I had to kind of figure out, okay, how are we going to structure things? How are we going to manage? And we were doing the traditional dementia appointments where they just continue to track your decline. It's actually enormously depressing. And so, um, and that was when my brother called, so I had kind of given up hope and was planning for the worst. And we were given an olive branch, really, to say, okay, this is something that's treatable, and this is something that we can do something about. And we did that for about 18 months. But, as I said, even at the beginning of that 15 months, he was diagnosed with late stage Alzheimer's disease, right? So a lot of damage had been done. And late stage illness, particularly when it's entrenched in your neural tissue, is difficult. And so his journey didn't end well, and he ended up going into a resident care facility in 2019, and then he passed away in 2022. So
Okay.
um,
So
yeah,
I wasn't sure. You had referenced we quite a few times, and I wasn't sure when you said that if you meant your brother and you, or the family that you have now, or you and your husband. So, dang. Okay.
Yeah.
The reason I asked that question is because even with how this outcome, or even what ended up happening with this particular story, there's never a reason to give up. You have to keep trying and keep learning until, like, literally there's nothing else to do. And obviously it made someone who's extraordinarily passionate about this. I'm sure you would have wished for it a different way. I fully understand that. But when you don't give up, there is at least some shred of positive or some shred of good that can come at, if for nothing else, other people from these things. And oftentimes, though, I have heard stories of people, if they don't give up, maybe, 12 months sucks, 15 months sucks, 24 months sucks. And then all of a sudden you find that one thing, and it can be useful. So for you now, you're obviously still in this space fully. And I'm guessing it's just completely driven by this passion to help and serve other people. With what you know now, is there anything that you believe could have been done differently? Because 2022 wasn't that long ago. Or is there a certain point where the person has just gotten far enough along that we're not necessarily going to be able to do anything naturally or with Western medicine?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the proper intervention would have really been sooner, right? So I think once we knew that we had tick-borne disease on board, I mean, we tried so many things, antibiotic therapies, herbal therapies, stem cell therapies. Like, I was trying everything that was in my disposal to get him better. And could we have made better decisions in that process that would have ended up having a better outcome? I'll never know, and I'll always question. But at the end of the day, I think that the proper answer is always going to be earlier diagnosis, right? Because I kind of liken neurological disease to a forest fire, right? Like, if you catch the forest fire early, it's going to be easier to put it out and to repair the damage, right? But once things have really gotten entrenched, which at first diagnosis, they were saying he was in late stage disease. And then it was another 15 months before we even started treatment. And he was declining so fast, so fast. And he had multiple infections on board. He had heavy metals, high levels of heavy metals. He had candida. He had elevated levels, elevated HSV titers. I mean, he had a lot going on. And so I think that at the end of the day, the thing that would have moved the needle more would have been if at that first appointment we had gotten a proper diagnosis, or, to your first question, when did I first start seeing symptoms? Like I said, in retrospect, there were symptoms way before. Like he had a panic attack back in 2009 that was completely out of the blue, and he was irritable when my son was born back in like 2011, which you chalk off to other things. Your doctor tells you it's okay, but I think now I look at symptoms like that through a whole nother lens that says, okay, that was warning signs, saying that his body was dealing with something, and we didn't really listen.
You've mentioned that question that I asked twice now, where it's like, when did these begin? And I appreciate, not that it's some profound question, but I do appreciate that you recognize why that's important to ask, because I think some people get on and they just kind of answer it willy-nilly. I'm like, no, the reason I've asked that 400 something times on the show is because when people realize something is wrong, like majorly, is almost never when things actually began. And if we can learn to, not to be cute or funny, but like put on these detective hats and actually start noticing subtle changes. I mean, you're talking, if there was something in 2011, right? Or even before that, that might have had something to do with your husband being off. That's over a decade before him passing that we could see some stuff. But guess what? You guys are smart and you still didn't know. So then I think about, unfortunately, the poor average people. It's like, no one's trained to think about this stuff, right? We're not even trained to realize what is common versus what's normal versus what's not normal. And we need to start thinking like that. So yes, that is the exact reason I ask, is because very often people will get on the show and be like, oh, I got a cancer diagnosis out of nowhere. I'm like, when did the symptoms start? Like a month or two before I had headaches. I'm like, that's when the symptoms really started? And then we dive deeper and it's like, oh, 15 years before this, I started getting GI symptoms or whatever it might be. There was a warning sign from the body. So if all of us can be more aware of that, I think it would help.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember my son came home from his entire daycare class when he was 18 months old. So this would have been like 2012-ish. His entire daycare class got hand, foot, and mouth disease, which generally you don't get as an adult unless your immune system is suppressed. And I didn't get it, but Russ got it. And I remember thinking, wow, why is his immune system suppressed? Why is he having challenges? And it's like things like that you don't really dig deeper. Like now I know that was a sign that it was kind of the beginning of the decline, and there were signs even before that. So I 100% agree that when did it begin is a very detailed question that like I said, I still think about it.
Okay. Let's dive into the technical. So I normally would say, like, what is someone's company? Where can they find it at the end? I actually think it's very appropriate to do this earlier in the show today, because I think it will lead to some of the more technical stuff. So I would imagine there are a million routes that you could have chosen to take with this pain that's happened in your life, right? You could be a counselor for others dealing with this. You could be a functional diagnostic nutrition practitioner like myself. You chose a very specific route with this Galaxy Diagnostics. What problem do you guys solve for these individuals that are suffering with these things?
Yeah. So, I think about on the other side of my journey, I did the whole advocacy thing. I shared my story. That's why I wrote the book. But at the end of the day, I'm an engineer and an entrepreneur, and I like to solve problems, right? Like this is what makes me happy. And I've spent my entire career bringing new technologies and new solutions to the market. And so I looked at, okay, this is obviously a space with massive amounts of problems. And if I had to think about, what the most critical problem was. And I look back on our journey, right? I look at that first doctor's visit when we got that negative test result, even though I know that Borrelia was on board, Borrelia, the bacteria causing Lyme disease. But we got a negative test result. And then when I started digging and researching, if you look at the standard of care diagnostics, it's only 40 to 60% accurate. And there's been multiple published studies that have shown this. And I think as an engineer, again, you read this and you're like, what? Like, how can that be possible that it's major disease that can lead to chronic debilitating symptoms of the brain, the heart, the joints, all sorts of body systems? And literally, you have a diagnostic that's about as accurate as a coin flip.
Mhm.
And it's crazy. And I had, that to me was really the key problem that needed to be solved. And fortunately, I've worked in medical devices and diagnostics for the last half of my career. And so it's kind of right in my wheelhouse. And so I started researching. I was like, okay, let's learn more about the standard of care and why it's so bad and what are the technical reasons for that. And then what are the other specialty labs that are in the space and what are they doing and what are they offering? And then what does the research say in the university setting? And what are the better ways to solve the problem? And as I scanned all of that landscape, I came across Galaxy, which I really thought was the best solution to the problem, right? So if you think about that key question, why is the current standard of care as accurate as a coin flip, right? The reality is the current testing is based upon antibodies, right? And a lot of people may not be as technically entrenched, but I think everybody has a little bit of a crash course on diagnostics in COVID, right? You have antibody testing is your immune response, right? And what happens when your immune system sees the pathogen. And if you want to know if you have COVID, you don't get an antibody test, right? You get an antigen or a PCR test because those are direct markers that the pathogen is present, right? Antibody testing is complicated because we're all different. We all have different host immune responses. You may have a very strong response and get the typical bullseye rash and a fever and some of the more traditional symptoms. Other people may not have any response at all, and they may be able to, like my husband, have the pathogen on board for years until their immune system hits maybe some sort of tipping point. Maybe they get another infection. Maybe they get run down because of stress. Maybe they get in a physical trauma. And so, antibody testing is complicated because it relies upon that host response, which is highly variable.
Mhm.
And so direct testing, where you have an antigen or a PCR test, is a much better approach. And that's what's universally preferred in infectious disease across all other diagnostics. The challenge is these pathogens are what is known as stealth pathogens, right? They're sneaky, they evade the immune system, they're in low abundance. And so like when you take a typical blood sample, right, the pathogen has to be in the tube, otherwise you're never going to be able to detect it. And if it's a low abundance pathogen, it may not be in the tube even though it's in your body. And so Galaxy was going after that hard problem. How do we enable direct detection? How do we lower the limits of detection? How do we use the right sample matrix, based upon the microbiology of the pathogen? So like, for example, blood isn't what we test for Lyme disease. We actually use urine because that's a much better sample matrix for detecting Lyme disease. And then for some of the other co-infections, we do blood testing, but in order to get accurate results, we do sample enrichment, we do concentration, we do things that make it an easier, lower the limits of detection to give us accurate results. And so I came across the company. I really just kind of reached out to the founders and said, hey, I'm a passionate person that wants to learn more. And once I realized that I thought it was a good fit for me and that the technology was real, I ended up taking over as CEO in the middle of last year. And since then, we've been really on our mission to bring the technology mainstream and to change the standard of care so that when you go to that first doctor's visit, you don't get a test that's as accurate as a coin flip, right? And also that's not just looking at Lyme disease, but eventually we want everybody to test for all the co-infections because some of the co-infections are actually, I believe, more common than Lyme, but people just aren't testing for them. So they seem rare. And one of the things I always say, it's always rare if you never test for it, right?
Sure.
So that's what we're trying to do. Is our mission is really to change the standard of care and to get better diagnostic tools out there so that people can get an accurate diagnosis and not do the descent into chronic illness where it's harder to dig out.
Okay, so one, you're on the right podcast for sure. I already see. Obviously, there's a lot going on in the chat. So, guys, normally I would wait till the 30-minute mark to invite any questions. But if you guys do have anything, I can't guarantee I'm going to ask them all. But please feel free to throw any questions that you have in the chat, and we'd love to get them shared. What I was going to ask next, though, is when does testing become especially for Lyme and co-infections specifically, when does that become appropriate? Because here's what I'm wondering. So one of our foundational labs that we talk about at FDN, it's not for Lyme. We focus on these foundational labs for pretty much all health issues to help restore function. We use the GI map, right, which is PCR DNA testing. And the thing with COVID that became very confusing, so for better or for worse, the PCR thing became very confusing because people would say, I tested positive, but I don't feel bad. I'm not sick. I never was sick. And so the person who's not in this space, through no fault of their own, didn't really understand what that meant. Like, I'm not sick. I can't be positive for this. It's like, well, no. You could be positive for it, but be completely asymptomatic, which is meaningful because we did label a lot of the cases, regardless of symptomology, as being positive. So there's a little confusion on both sides, it seems. With something like the GI map, though, the reason I'm connecting it to what you're talking about is we'll see, let's take an easy one, like H. pylori shows up on a lot of GI maps. But how the client for us is presenting will change the way that we make meaning out of that result. So if the person has H. pylori on the GI map and says, yeah, I end up in the hospital a few times a year with severe stomach pains, maybe they had ulcers or something. I've had cystic acne. I've had some mental health issues, these kind of loose things that can be associated with H. pylori. I've had thyroid issues as well. We know that can affect certain thyroid antibodies. Okay, I'm now going to take that a lot more seriously. If I find that there is zero symptomology whatsoever that seems to be correlated with the infection, I might address it, but it's not going to be my top priority. So the reason I'm using that example is hopefully it'll connect in my FDN's heads here. I want to know, like, when would you test? Because if we go back to your husband, for example, there was a time where he probably had this, but he felt okay. And then there was a time where he had symptoms, but obviously not major enough that you guys were saying that anything was like wildly wrong. And then even when you thought, hey, maybe he's depressed or off, there was something more severe than even you realized. So I guess, how do you know when to even use this type of testing?
It's a great question. And I think I have three different answers, based upon it. I think certainly if you're symptomatic, and I do think that as a whole, our society needs to redefine symptomatic, because I know, I'm in my 40s now, and I talk to most of my friends, they have complain of back pain or fatigue or other things that we've kind of normalized. So I think that a lot of people have conditions that we just kind of chalk up to old age that I think, again, are things and symptoms that we need to be listening to and trying to say, okay, is there something deeper that we need to address? I believe, and there are very well documented cases and prevalence rates of these infections in people that are asymptomatic, right? So, but again, what that means is, depends on what's defined. But I believe longer term that I think kind of the third answer is, I believe that this should be something, particularly in endemic areas, but eventually I hope everywhere, where you're just screening for it on a regular basis.
I was wondering if you were going to go there.
Yeah, because, I want to know if I have this pathogen, if it's on board, and I might not feel badly now, just like, back in maybe 2010 and 2011, like my husband. But I would want to know if it's on board, because if it is, then if your immune system reaches a tipping point, say you have a surgery, say you get another infection. I mean, a lot of people got really taken sideways by COVID. And one of the things we're studying is some of the roles of these pathogens in, okay, so if you're feeling terrible after your case of COVID, or if you're suffering from long COVID, what's the correlation to having Bartonella or Babesia on board, or other, or Lyme or other infections? And so, and then the question of always when to treat. Okay, if you're positive and you're asymptomatic, do you treat? And I think that's a perfect personal decision. But the good news about these pathogens is they respond really well to herbal treatments. And so there's a lot of you don't have to go straight to, broad spectrum antibiotics in order to treat. You can take some immune supportive herbs. You can take some, bactericidal herbs that are very effective against these pathogens, and potentially put yourself on a different trajectory. So I think it should be something. So we're trying to advocate for it in screening for people that are symptomatic, and also people that are, I went 1 and 3, but I forgot 2. 2 is if you really have conditions that are associated with these illnesses, right? So like rheumatoid arthritis, chronic fatigue syndrome, dementia. There's a lot of linkages, as you heard with my husband's story, actually schizophrenia and chronic anxiety. There's a lot of neuropsychiatric symptoms. And so I think a lot of people that are even in a chronic disease bucket should be looking at, well, what's the root cause? And is a pathogen potentially something that's on board that's causing it? And so I'd like to see it used more widely. But that question of what to do about it obviously varies by person. But I think, like I said, a lot of herbal therapies give us a lot of options.
Yeah, well, and man, that's a whole separate, not even just topic, but probably a podcast. It is kind of cool and encouraging because I remember, I wish I could cite this offhand. It was probably 5, 6 years ago, but I was watching something um, done by Rachel with biobotanicals. And they were showing how certain things in biocidin, if not biocidin itself, were actually more effective than certain Western treatments. And when you combine both, again, I'm speaking very loosely because I don't remember exactly what I read, but I was fascinated to see that they were actually taking the time to study this stuff and realizing, yeah, if you combine both, it was like more effective than one or the other. And it's like, wow, that's kind of cool when we can make an actual argument for this. But it wasn't even the next thing I was going to get to. So number 3, I obviously would support the heck out of this, especially as someone from Pennsylvania. Like, this is just so common. And again, so the average person understands that ticks are a risk. You could get Lyme disease, but they don't understand how bad it could really be. I watched my best friend have the Bell's palsy because of it, right? And he was like the healthiest person I ever knew, and it still affected someone like him. So it doesn't discriminate there. My point in mentioning number 3, though, is, listen, my friend, this is not a diminishing of a dream. If anyone's going to do it, I'll bet all my money on you for figuring that out. But you and I both know how long-term that goal would be and how complicated that'd be, because there's also people advocating, well, full thyroid panel should be done, at every checkup and stuff like that. So the cost associated with this stuff is one of the bigger things. So let's talk with number 1 and number 2 then. Symptomology and disease is often associated with it. So are you separating, because 1 and 2 sound similar, so just to be clear, are you separating those in like, having one singular panic attack is a symptom, not a disease, but a disease is rheumatoid arthritis? So more number 2 would be like a specific diagnosis where 1 is just general symptomology.
Right. Like, for example, I would like to screen every schizophrenia patient for Bartonella, right? Because Bartonellosis has been associated. We've done studies. Our partners and our founder over at NC State has done studies that showed, his first study was 17 schizophrenia patients. 65% of them were positive for Bartonella. And we have case reports of people with Bartonella diagnoses that get the appropriate antibiotic therapies and their symptoms go away. Right.
Whoa.
So, yes. So, and this is something we need to do more studies on. Then they did a follow-on study with over 100 patients with Columbia University. And you are 3 times more likely to have Bartonella on board if you had a psychotic event compared to the controls. Right. So there's a correlation there. And we're understanding the biochemical mechanisms that lead to some of these pathways. And there's been similar studies with Borrelia showing that Borrelia increases the production of quinolinic acid, which is something that overstimulates key receptors in your brain, leading to psychotic behavior. And so, and we had a published case report from an autopsy patient. Actually, it was a tragic case that led to a homicide-suicide, and they found elevated levels of quinolinic acid in his brain. And this kid had been taking PCP to kind of downregulate, and it's known, PCP is known to downregulate the receptors that quinolinic acid elevates, right? So it's like there's biochemical mechanisms that we're starting to understand, and certain disease states, particularly in mental health, need to be explored and shared. And then similarly in dementia, I mean, I'm not saying all dementia cases are caused by pathogens, but there's mounting research that pathogens, including Borrelia, and not just tick-borne infections, but there's multiple infections that have been linked to Alzheimer's disease. So for high-risk individuals and for people that live in endemic areas, it absolutely should be part of the screening protocol, because if you can save a person from a life of descension into the abyss, I mean, I watched it firsthand. It is not a pretty pathway. And so if you can take somebody off that trajectory, we need to be doing it. So absolutely, I think certain disease states, but then there's just the more general symptomology of, I feel tired, I have aches and pains, I have migrating joint pain, I have fevers. Like, anytime you have kind of non-specific symptoms that could be associated with tick-borne illness, absolutely get yourself screened.
Okay. So yeah, and that would apply to probably many people in our world here at FDN where like there's these ongoing lingering things. So those could be fairly general, just like a malaise even that's been lasting
Mhm.
years, and you're doing other things, right? You're
Yeah.
trying to live better than most people in terms of how you eat, how you sleep, all that stuff, and yet you're still getting your butt kicked a little bit. I've wondered this for myself. They actually, thank God, it just took 10 years. Doctors did test me for Lyme disease, but I started getting sick at 5, and I wasn't tested until probably 15 to 17. Now, at the time, it was said it was negative, but we like even where we live, not only was it Pennsylvania where it's super common in a lot of the deer ticks, my parents had 3.5 acres surrounded by farmland. So this is kind of nutty. I won't tell the full story. It's not even the point, but I did a 60-day camping experiment. It's like infamous here at FDN during COVID, just to see what would happen to circadian rhythms and all that kind of stuff. And every night, Nicole, I fully zipped up the tent. I actually kept the tent very bare on purpose. And every night I'd walk out, and it seems ridiculous, but to you it won't. But I'm just saying to someone who doesn't get this stuff, I would make sure I walked out barefoot. And the reason that I did that is because I wanted my legs completely exposed. So then I would go into the tent. I would do a full inspection on my legs and toes to make sure I didn't just pick up any. And the amount of times, I mean, if I camped for 60 days, there's probably 5 or 6 nights I picked off ticks directly from me. I only walked 150 feet
Yeah.
from the house to the tent. So I had to be so extra careful with this stuff. And it's just, I'm thinking if I'm that careful and it was still happening, how could this not have happened or been at least plausible that it could have happened to me at 5, 6 years old? And my first symptoms of health issues were like migraines and panic attacks.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, who knows?
I mean, I can't even tell you how many times that we've talked to people that have just generic symptoms. I mean, we have several case reports, particularly in the Pennsylvania area, where, people in their 40s, women in their 40s go into the doctor because they're like, okay, I'm experiencing perimenopause, right? And I feel tired, I feel fatigued, like I want to get a functional medicine workup to balance my hormones. And, we have most of our providers in the Pennsylvania area very well versed in the disease and tick-borne illness, and they screen them and they test positive for Lyme disease, right? And this is not antibody-based testing. This is direct testing, a urine antigen test. And so it's like, well, you may be experiencing hormonal imbalances that might be part of your problem, but you also have an active case of Lyme. So let's also address that, right? So it's just one of those things I always encourage people to think about. And there's more and more information available that people can look at to understand, okay, is this something that could potentially be impacting my health?
I see a bunch of comments. I promise we're going to get to at least a good amount of them, but I wanted to jump to this one because it's probably the next thing I would have asked. I might have missed this. Join later. I would like to have this test ordered for myself. Is that possible, or do we as FDNs need to have a lab agreement to get it? So, either way, I'm definitely going to be talking to Nicole off air about the FDN side of this. So don't worry, Empowered Functional Health. But what I did want to know, this probably relevant to them, is this direct to consumer, or do you have to go through some type of provider?
So right now you go through the provider. So if you have an MPI number, you can order the test. We are for direct to consumer. I think we just literally Wednesday announced a relationship with Mosaic Diagnostics.
Okay.
And so they have kind of a broader network of providers than we do because they're slightly larger. And they have a relationship with any lab test now. So that's not active now, but probably in the next 60, 90 days, you could potentially get the order done as a consumer through any lab test now.
Well, and then Empowered Functional Health. So if you don't already know this, Mosaic was formerly Great Plains. So you can get an account directly with Mosaic as an FDN. Mosaic also just made an agreement. They're making moves. They just also made an agreement with Avexia, which of course we have access to as FDN. So if not right now, well, that's instantly available with Mosaic if you had the Mosaic account, right?
It's instantly, you can, as of Wednesday, you can order with Mosaic. You can
awesome.
also set up accounts directly with Galaxy, and we can support you in that journey. But either way, you can get access to the technology.
Cool.
And we have launched tests for Borrelia, Bartonella, and Babesia. And over time, we're going to add the other top tick-borne infections as well.
Right. And Meg, just a comment here, but I definitely think it's worth mentioning. Meg was like knee problems, rheumatic symptoms, anxiety, brain fog, ADHD, rage, mental health, postpartum. I'm like, holy crap. Like, oh, maybe this was a little Lyme thing when I was younger. there was a lot going on mental health wise for sure. So, but are you generally in consensus of all this?
Absolutely. I mean, I think we see lots of joint symptoms. We saw lots of neuropsychiatric symptoms, lots of fatigue. And it's difficult to discern which pathogen really, there's a lot of overlap between the different pathogens. So there are some things that are specific to one pathogen versus the other and may indicate one's on board, but a lot of them are really, non-specific symptoms. And so that's why it's really important to do testing, because if you just look at Borrelia, Bartonella, Babesia, I mean, they all have different treatment protocols, in the traditional, because, Babesia is a parasite. Bartonella and Borrelia are both bacteria, but they interact and respond to different antibacterials and antibiotics. And so it's really important for you to understand, what each person has on board.
Yeah. Now we're definitely getting into my area of ignorance, so forgive me for this question if it's silly, but I have heard people sometimes get testing later down the road. They believe that they were exposed to the tick or whatever it might have been years ago, and then they find out that they had it. And I don't really fully understand what that means. So with Galaxy Diagnostics, I'm sure you can't guarantee this, but someone like me, like if I was infected at 5 and I'm 29 now, is there anything lingering that I would be able to see, or would that be circumstantial, or is that a ridiculous thing to ask because it's been 24 years?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's one of the things that is powerful about what we have at Galaxy is, so you can get testing and you can get antibody-based testing and you can see, okay, have you been exposed, right? So you guess that you might be exposed. If you have really high antibody titers, if you're using a technique that actually measures titers, that could be indicative of an active infection. Or it also could be indicating just an overactive immune system because of response to another infection. So you really don't know. And that's why using antibody, measurements as your only source of diagnostics is challenging. The reason I really like direct detection is because it tells you, it's an indicative that you have the infection that's on board right now. If you have DNA of the pathogen in your blood, or you have proteins that are shed by the pathogen in your urine, then that's telling you that this is likely contributing to your health problems right now. And so you can we have some antibody-based tests. We have, direct tests, and we'll continue to kind of build in both because they're useful not only for diagnosis, but treatment monitoring and so forth. And so understanding how and what that means to your current health condition, that direct testing is key.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to jump to some questions here. Tracy, does Galaxy have clinical advisors to help with testing data? And so what that means, like the FDN perspective, if we run any tests through our stuff, we can book in with a clinical advisor, which a lot of them are Lyme literate, Tracy, so they could probably help with a lot of this stuff. And there's certainly many of them are co-infection literate as well. But do you guys have anything directly at Galaxy, or maybe something with Mosaic now?
Yeah, so Mosaic has some clinical support. We at Galaxy also, we take this very seriously. So we don't have a provider per se at this point, although we do have multiple clinical advisory board members that slot in for particular discussions if needed. But we talk, our head of clinical sales and also our head of R&D. We're often on calls discussing patient results and kind of sharing things. We're very involved with the cases that we support and really trying to understand what's leading to some of these, positive results, and assimilating and sharing them with other providers so that we can, really advance the knowledge in the space.
Look how crazy this is. Angela said, Pennsylvania, born and raised here. We've all had Lyme disease. I don't know anybody in Western PA who hasn't had someone in their family diagnosed. And again, we know the diagnosing is not perfect.
Yeah.
So that's kind of insane to read.
It
Wow.
is. I mean, I was just in DC last week doing an educational event for Congress. And I said, we have 500,000 people that we know of that are diagnosed and treated. That's diagnosed and treated. And so with a test that's 50% accurate, how many people are we missing, right? How many people are running around with alternate diagnoses? Like, it's unacceptable. And so, and I think people up in Pennsylvania and in some of the other endemic areas really get it because you're right in Ground Central. But we also talked to a lot of people in other states. It's like, well, we don't have Lyme in our area. And it's like, come on, right? And even if that was true, I mean, does nobody ever travel? Like, it's just, so there's still a lot of misinformation that's out there. And that's one of the things we're trying to combat and give people the science. What does the science say? And because that at the end of the day will be what ends up winning.
Yeah, and then of course the whole topic of they think half these things can only come from ticks, which is not true. And then
Right.
two, they think that they would notice a tick. The amount of times I've heard someone say, "Oh, I would notice a tick crawling on me." No, you would not.
Yeah.
They are so subtle and so small. Like you could be looking. The amount of times that I've been looking and I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this thing's halfway up my freaking leg right now in a hike or whatever." So I mean, we don't need to talk about this today. This is something that they could easily look up on YouTube. But guys, make sure you take the time to educate yourselves on tips for hiking, tips for gardening, whatever. There are some things that you can do because I'm sure prevention is probably the number one thing here, right? If we could just stop it to begin with, that's
Right.
obviously ideal. But even that is, if you work outside or you're hiking in certain areas every week, I just cannot imagine you not having one of these things on your body at some point. Now, whether it transmits a disease, whether it's on long enough for it to do that, that's a whole separate thing. But you got to take at least the basic precautions. Do you have any? I mean, again, I know you probably don't want to touch on that as much because it's not fun or as fun and nerdy, but are there any prevention like tools and tricks or hacks that you have? Any sprays that you recommend, clothing recommendations? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I personally at my house we use a lot of the Sawyer products, so permethrin on clothes and picaridin on bodies. I use actually those tick control tubes. I don't know if you've seen those, but it's basically permethrin coated cotton that you put in little tubes around your property. And what happens is because people think about deer because of the deer tick, but actually young ticks live on mice. And so what happens is these cotton swabs are soaked in permethrin, which is toxic to the ticks. The mice take it, they put it in their burrows, and then their bodies are covered with permethrin and it kills all the young ticks. And so I put those around my yard to help protect because before I started doing kind of yard prevention, my dogs were constantly bringing ticks into the house,
Yeah.
and since I started doing yard protection, we don't see any, and so I think that's
Wow.
really key because you got to have a safe space, right? You have to have a place where you can feel comfortable, and I with all the PTSD after my husband's illness, it was like I couldn't feel like I could even relax inside my own home because the dogs were just bringing ticks inside. And so getting that control over the area was key for me to just kind of get over some of that anxiety.
It's such a good point about the dogs as well, right? Just another thing we don't think about. It's like we had this well, we have her still. I just don't live at my family's house full time. A little Shishan, and so she has white fur, and it's kind of easy enough to see this stuff. But like the amount of times, like we've checked her real quick, and she brought something in. It's sad because it was just last year. She doesn't have any symptoms, and I mean, as much as we can see, she's a dog, right? But she had like one of the ticks and we sent it out. PA has one of the free labs to test the tick itself.
Mm-hmm.
And it did have Lyme disease on it. So we don't know how long it was on her and all that kind of stuff. But like we try, we're aware of this stuff, looking for it. And so you can't even comprehend what it's like for the person that just doesn't even realize that this is an issue or thinks that it's not in their state just because it's not as prevalent as something like Pennsylvania and crazy as it is up there. This is still other places, folks. Let's buff out some more questions, and I will, if Nicole allows me, I'll steal an extra like 5-10 minutes of her time since you guys are throwing some good stuff in. What is the difference between the 1-day panels versus the 3-day panels, the test kits? What is the benefit? I should have my glasses on. Sorry. What is the benefit of each? Again, sorry if this info has been covered. I don't think we have.
Yeah, no. So this is a great question. So the 3-day panels were really started out of our knowledge of Bartonella, because Bartonella is, as I said, there's links to mental illness, there's links to rheumatoid arthritis and lots of other chronic conditions, endocarditis in your heart. And so the life cycle, Bartonella actually can live in the endothelial cells of your vasculature. And the life cycle is it only cycles in and out of the blood once every 7 days. And so what was found at the research over at NC State, so our founder, Dr. Ed Breichwart, is literally like one of the leading experts, if not the leading expert on Bartonella. They found that because it cycles in and out of the blood on this kind of 7-day cycle, if you did 3 draws within a 7-day period, you were much more likely to get a positive with a direct testing result. And so that's where the 3-day draw came from. 1-day draws are really just because sometimes 3-day draws are difficult to get, and because you will get positives, but you might not necessarily get to the best possible sensitivity just because of that cyclical nature. But one of the things that we're finding is that it's also helping with Babesia detection, and that we're getting better results with the 3-day draw with Babesia. And again, I think this is just because these are low abundance infections. And so I think that, the example that Dr. Breichwart always uses is, if I'm sitting in a boat and I have a bucket and I put the bucket in the ocean and I look in it and I don't see any jellyfish, right? Does that mean that there's not any jellyfish in the ocean? Right? No, it doesn't mean so. So the amount that you take and the cycling and when you draw the blood matters. And for these low abundance infections, having these multiple draws increases the probability of detection. So we
smart.
realize that's not accessible for everybody, especially for patients that may have difficult getting to phlebotomy, and so we do the 1-day draw as well. But for best results, the 3-day draw is kind of the best option.
I was just about to ask. So, assuming someone's willing, ready, and able, 3-day would always be preferred.
Right.
Okay,
yes.
got it. Meg is so into this. I love this, Meg. Thanks for being here. Obsessed with Dr. B.
He's amazing.
Let me know if he does interviews. I'm in Wilmington, North Carolina. I'm almost like, dang, we don't do in-person ones right now. And I shouldn't say this on the podcast yet. We're not supposed to announce it, but we might be doing more in-person ones when I move to Austin in September. But I've kind of wanted to do some. I'm like, holy cow, I would drive up there, rent a podcast studio and see what happens. So we can talk about that off air. Dr. Emmanuel said hello. Dr. Emmanuel, I always forget where you're from. I'm sorry. Let me know. Is Lyme something that you even think about on a regular basis or other tick-borne illnesses? Let me know. Okay. I think, there was one other thing I never got to. Meg, you had posted a lot of stuff and I wanted to make sure we got to this. This is from way earlier, like almost 30 minutes ago. Megan said, the elephant in the room is the cost of testing and the lack of insurance coverages. I would like to encourage every person planning to become pregnant to have comprehensive tick-borne testing. Often we could prevent the autoimmune diseases that come on when microbial pathogens are caught early. That's probably a powerful recommendation, right? If we can't do it for every single person that walks in a doctor's office yet, and it might be years before that, I'd certainly advocate for throwing that on the list for pregnant women, amongst many other tests that I would do, admittedly. But yeah, great comments. Okay. And I think we are all caught up. Angela just said, I'm so thankful that you are having this discussion. It is insanely frustrating how skewed the Lyme conversation is within allopathic medicine. Nicole, didn't I promise they were going to love this before? And it's a Friday. We had all these people hanging out live with you. So if you guys have any final questions, I'll take like one or two more from the audience because we are over time anyway. But I'm happy to get one or two more here. So as FDNs, again, I'm going to talk to Nicole off air because there's probably something more that we can do. But practically speaking, guys, I know for a fact we all can get accounts with Mosaic if you're a graduated FDN. So just reach out to them, make sure you have your certificate, and you'll be good to go. It sounds what a timely podcast. We didn't do that on purpose, but you should be good to go there. And as Mosaic and Avexia's, I don't know if they're fully on that or there yet, but as that finalizes, you might even be able to have the convenience of doing it through Avexia as well. One thing I wanted to ask you, Nicole, and I'll specify this for you so you don't get yourself in trouble here. What I'm about to ask you, we're not expecting medical advice. I'm asking a personal opinion of what you would do because you mentioned the herbal remedies. And when I've had people on with tick-borne illnesses or co-infections in the past, or people who are passionate about it, a lot of them actually are huge advocates for, if you just got the infection and you know it, like you have the bullseye rash, right? You know that this just happened. They are huge advocates for taking the Western medicine route, at least initially. Personally speaking, not medical advice for anyone else, are you in that camp, or would you go straight to herbals, or a mix of both?
So if you're talking about in the acute scenario,
Yes.
I would, if I had symptoms, I would definitely consider going, to the antibiotic route. Every time I get any sort of, suspected exposure, we always go the herbal route, right? Immune support, herbal therapies. I have some kind of, tetracycline that I have in a bottle that we put on the tick bite and so forth. And so there's certain things that we do as general precautions. I think for later stage disease, I am a believer that herbal therapies, are very powerful. And we have several doctors that believe that, patients do better on those, but there's still the targeted integration of antibiotics can also be useful in certain cases. So it's kind of a complex situation. But I know, like for my son, for example, I found out after my husband's journey that my son had Bartonella. And that was, if you end up reading my book, my son had a lot of health issues that I was navigating at the same time. And I could never get a positive test result and figure out if there was a tick-borne disease on board. And after I started working with Galaxy, I was like, okay, I'm going to get him tested because he had some symptoms that started to flare and made me think of Bartonella. And sure enough, he was positive. And we treated 100% with herbals, and he did beautifully. So 6 months on an herbal protocol, and he's doing great. So it does work. It's a powerful tool for both acute and, and chronic situations.
Fair enough. That seems to be the general consensus, at least on our podcast, which probably might be biased one way. I don't know. But it's like the more acute, okay, just do what you got to do. Add some Western in. The farther along we are, the farther you go, it seems the more people are just like, dude, just mix up some herbal and lifestyle stuff to get this going here. So Wendy, I will get your question last for this because I apologize that I did not do this earlier. I did see it. She came on a little bit late. She said Anoplasma. I've never read that word or said it out loud. So and I think there was a different way that she worded the question first. So it was, gosh, sorry. So many comments today. This is good. What is your experience with that specifically? There you go, Wendy.
Yeah, so Anoplasma is absolutely on our radar screen, and it is one of the kind of top 6 infections. So we don't have testing offerings for it now, but I think if you follow us in the future, the top ones on our list, Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, Rickettsia, that's kind of, right now we cover 1, 2, 3, which is Bartonella, Babesia, and Borrelia. And then 4, 5, 6 would be kind of Anaplasma, Ehrlichia, and Rickettsia as kind of the top 6 pathogens in the US.
Okay. Well, Wendy, I promised we'd get to you last. Guys, we're going to chat out where we can find her and all that other good stuff, but please drop a thank you below. It seems like a lot of you guys really enjoyed this today, so we'd love to just get a thank you for her and her time. And I'm sure you would have liked it to be a little bit different, but your story is extraordinarily powerful nonetheless. And what a force to be reckoned with. Again, if anyone's going to change some stuff, I'll put my money on you and Galaxy Diagnostics all day long.
Thank you.
Just to say it one more time directly, because our audio listeners too, remember, they might be in the kitchen or driving a car or something while they're listening to us. So one last time, where can they find you guys directly? And is there anywhere that they can follow you even on social?
Yeah, so GalaxyDX.com is our website, and we're actually going to be in the process of updating it in the next 30 days. So check it out today and then come back in 30 days because it'll probably be updated to make it easier for folks. And then we're also on Instagram, Galaxy Diagnostics, Facebook, Galaxy DX, and then LinkedIn is, I think, Galaxy Diagnostics Inc. Yes. So
we got you. Your book, is that on Amazon or anywhere else that they can find it? And remember, please say the title again.
Yep. So it's on Amazon. The title is What Lurks in the Woods. And you can find it there. You can also find information on me personally at NicoleDanielleBell.com. That's a site that I put when I first launched the book before I was with Galaxy. And there's some educational videos and other things that I've done to really kind of explain tick-borne diseases and make it accessible. I've done kind of a lot of work with the Center for Lyme Action and with Lyme Warrior and Project Lyme and other places just to kind of, summarize the science in a way that's accessible to folks. And so it might be helpful for providers and also for patients, who maybe are struggling to trying to figure it out. There's some useful resources there.
Mm-hmm. We're going to finish with the signature question for the show. It's kind of interesting to ask you because I'm sure you're into a lot of natural and alternative stuff now, but you kind of have this specific passion or sub-passion within the space. So I still think you're just a cool person to ask, and I'm curious what you're going to say. So if we could give you a magic wand, we're just speaking generally now, not necessarily about Lyme or co-infections. If we could give you a magic wand and you could wave it and you could get all of our viewers and listeners to do one thing for their health. So that means you can get us all to start doing one thing, or you can get us all to stop doing one thing. What is the one thing Nicole gets us to do?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. Given my passion, I think it would be really listening to your symptoms and to the signs that your body is telling you. As we talked about earlier, I think it's way too common to get a headache and to brush it off, or to get a panic attack and to brush it off. And doctors will tell you to brush it off. I mean, like I said, when my husband had one a decade before I realized he was sick, the doctor was like, oh, it'll be fine. Let me know if it happens again. Right. And so it would really be to listen to your body and to dig deeper. Right. Mm-hmm. And if you have things that seem off, it's intimidating, I think, a lot of times to to go to a doctor and have them say, well, there's nothing wrong, but you might not be an expert in medicine, but you are an expert in you. And so keep
Yes.
digging, right? Keep digging. If you know something's wrong, and just keep tick-borne disease on your differential, because it exists in way more places than people realize.
Okay. Thank you so much for coming on today.